So take me there in the early 90s. So you launched Epic Games in 1991. So the writing of your first big video game, ZZT, what was it like? What was the technical challenges? What were the psychological challenges of building that?
It was a funny project because I didn't start out to build a video game. I just moved from an Apple II so my brother bought my family an Apple II right after I'd visited him in California. So I've been programming on that for a few years, learned a lot of techniques, but weren't many Apple II users around still by the time that cycle came to an end. And so I just gotten an IBM PC of my own. I was learning to program, and I realized I needed a text editor. So I started writing a text editor. A text editor is a program to edit text files. You have logic to move the cursor around and let people type things and backspace and delete and do all of those, mundane actions. And, one night I was like, I'd finished it up and I was like, well, okay, I have a text editor, but this is pretty boring. And so I made the cursor into a smiley face character. And I had the different characters you could place in this document perform different gameplay actions. Some would be walls, and some would kill you, and some would be moving objects that could fly around the screen. And so this text editor I made evolved into a little game editor. So I was building these levels for a game. I put a lot of time into building an editor and a primitive set of objects, about 20 or 30 different objects, enough to build a really cool and compelling game, but not so many that players would lose track of what they're seeing. I started off just building different game levels. The idea is you'd be on a series of boards. They'd be connected by, going north past the end of the current board would take you to a new one if it was open, or maybe it was blocked and you couldn't go there. I built this whole game world around that, and, this was the game that became ZCT. And, I was having fun with it, building it and playing it, but I didn't know if it would really work, so, I did this experiment. I started inviting neighbors over, some adults, some kids of all different ages, and, sat them down in front of it and say, like, "Here's a game I made, figure it out."
Yeah.
And, I had to force myself not to tell them what they need to do, right? Because I really wanted to learn if they were able to discover it all for themselves. Today we would call this user experience test. And there's a whole field of research around user
Yeah.
experience research. But back then it was just inviting some kids over to play the game. I took notes about what they got stuck on and what they enjoyed and where they felt bored, and just iteratively polished the game until I felt it was good. And then I put it out and released it on. Well, this was before the internet, so there were bulletin boards. I uploaded it to a bunch of local bulletin boards, and from there, it started spreading because, the way to build up cred for bulletin board users was to upload new files and to claim that, hey, I was the first that brought this to you.
Mm-hmm.
And, so there was a natural tendency of the software to spread. I decided to use the Shareware model. So I didn't just build this one game. I built a trilogy of 3 games.
Mm-hmm.
I released the first one for free, and I said, "Hey, if you like this, buy the 2 sequels." And, I included my parents' mailing address and, said, "Send us, $30 and, you can get the sequels to this game." And, the check started coming in, within a few days. I was making, getting 3 or 4 orders a day. I was making, $100 a day. I'm like, "Woo, I'm rich." 'Cause, being a 20-year-old, that was, a pretty big deal.
What did that feel like? Just getting money and probably feeling this immense success from something you've created.
Well, I've looked at money always just as a tool to help you fund accomplishing cool things. And having enough to do the things you want to do is the critical thing. It's always been just very utilitarian. But the knowledge that other people all around the country and then in a month later all around the world were playing the game, that was mind boggling. That me, like this little kid who'd put out a game on a local bulletin board, could be doing international business and shipping discs all over the world, to players, because the software was spreading on its own, was just magical. And that was a new thing for software. Like that did not happen with mechanical devices. Like you manufactured one, you sold it to somebody, and they had it, and that was it. But software could spread. That was just really cool to see, and it made me realize there's really no upward limit on the potential for a business like that. We saw Microsoft as the big juggernaut company at the time, but it's like, hey, if Epic does games good enough, we could accomplish what they've accomplished with operating systems. And the sky was the limit. And I think this is the age we live in now. You don't have to be an industrialist manufacturing physical products. Anybody who builds anything digitally, if it's good enough, you can reach the entire world and build the next Microsoft or Meta or Apple or Google or Epic Games.
It's such a cool origin story, though. You start out building a text editor. So you're looking at this project, you're playing around with it, you're building up the tools. It's it's such an inspiring moment because a lot of us start out building a project, and to allow yourself to see the potential pivots, the potential trajectories that can go is really nice. To sit back, allow yourself to be bored, and like, I'm gonna go this way. I mean, that's like a crossroads. You came to a crossroads. I mean, you built, compilers. You design your own programming language. You build compilers, databases, all these things you mentioned, and you started building a text editor. And then here it came to this crossroad. I'm gonna make this fun. And then from there, one of the most legendary gaming companies was created. It's kind of cool. Like that's an inspiring thing for sort of developers. Like, be open to the possibility of creating something you didn't plan to create and just go with it, right? That's cool.
Yeah, and it was a bunch of learnings emerged really quickly there. The neat thing I did with ZZT was I didn't just release the game, I also released the editor with it.
Hmm.
I built this tool so I could make these ZZT boards that people could play, but I also gave it to all of the players themselves, and, like 30 years later, I still run into people, when I go to a game industry event, it was like, I grew up playing ZZT. And, here's an adult who grew up playing my game. And it was because it enabled anybody to become a creator too. It had, this little board editor, and it also had a little scripting language, so you could learn a little bit of programming in it too. And it kind of impressed, and it really set a formative principle of Epic, which was that, the company's mission is to make awesome entertainment, but also awesome tools, and to share those tools with everybody so that they can build their own amazing things too. And when we got into Unreal Engine a few years later, the interplay between us building a game and us building tools that were widely used by others was a critical part of that. And I think that's the sole reason that Epic has been massively successful. And actually, the reason that we've survived all of this time is that by serving both creators and gamers, we've been able to weather the ups and downs of the game industry. It's a brutal place for companies. We've been able to survive every financial downturn, and sometimes the engine's been funding the business because we didn't have a game, and sometimes the games have been funding the business. And it really set a principle in our culture that's persevered and is continually brought to the forefront.
But on the editor front, that's such a fascinating philosophy that you always allow people to create their own worlds. You have an engine from which you simulate the world that the game is in. You have the actual game, and you also have the freedom for creators to create various, in Fortnite, islands of their own. So it's like with everything you ship, that freedom to create is always there. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's something we aim to do more and more fully over time. In the course of building Fortnite, we've built a lot of other tools that are useful for us too, because it's not just a game powered by Unreal Engine, but it's also, a social ecosystem where people can make friends and voice chat and get together in parties. And we've opened up all of those social features into Epic Online Services, and we give them away to all developers for free because we all benefit from growth in that user base. And our goal is ultimately to build the company's products on the same technology that we share with everybody else, and to hope that foster a bigger and bigger ecosystem over time where everybody benefits.
If we could just linger on the 90s.
Mhm.
So you said bulletin boards. Maybe you can explain what that's like, and also explain the birth of the internet, what that was like. What was the internet like in the 90s?
So the internet is a funny thing. It started out as this Defense Department
Yeah.
research project called the ARPANET, the Advanced Research Project Agency Network, and it was kind of like this revered secret thing.
Yeah.
That became more and more open as they connected universities. Universities connected to the internet in the mid 1980s, and so if you were at a prestigious institution with access to computers, you could get on there. But a consumer back then, we just had these modems. This thing you plug into your phone line, and it dials up a phone number, and then it sends wild sound effects over the over the telephone line to send digital signals back and forth. And these were really slow. The first modem I had was 300 baud. That means 30 characters per second
Mhm.
of data. So you're like sitting there watching a sentence like slowly emerge character by character as you're going online. But yeah, that's how we got online and we talked with each other. So you dial up to a local bulletin board. It'll be run by a person. Usually they have a computer or two sitting in their kitchen or something that's running the bulletin board. And they have a small community of a few hundred users, all competing to connect to that one phone line. It was often busy and you couldn't get in, and the more popular bulletin boards were hardest to get to.
Nice.
But you had all kinds of communities develop, and you could see, like, there was the programming communities where people talked about programming. There was the news and events, community. I lived in the outskirts of Washington, D.C., so that was, like, a big thing. But then there was, like, the pirate community where they're sharing pirated Apple II games and, very different, community ethos, and mantras out there, but all really nice and also very small. These bulletin boards couldn't grow to the size of Facebook because your phone line couldn't take that many calls.
Mhm.
And then later in the 1990s, the internet, which had been fostered in these colleges, started opening up to the public, and anybody could connect to it. And suddenly, the world took on a life of its own. It became much easier to reach a global audience faster.
And you would start shipping games to the internet, which is a bit of a crazy thing to do because you're supposed to have like a physical copy, but to post on the internet is pretty innovative. Even Shareware is pretty innovative.
Yeah, it's been a funny transition for the game business. Epic started out making shareware games distributed digitally. But as the first 3D games took off, like Wolfenstein and Doom from id Software, and then Unreal from us, took off. To reach a huge audience of millions of users, we had to go into retail stores. So we worked with a retail publisher, and they made a box, and they put CD-ROMs in the box, and then the world started transitioning back to digitally. Like, and that transition didn't start well, right? The initial transition of gaming to digital was all BitTorrent, all piracy.
Mhm,
And there are horror stories about games that would, sell like 100,000 copies but have 2 million users,
mhm.
because most people pirated it. And then, Steam came along and introduced digital distribution and made digital distribution of legit games so convenient that most players moved away from piracy towards that. And their practices were then followed by others, and the early digital industry took form.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, pirates do lead the way for innovation. The same as the story of Spotify. You basically, I think most people, when they derive value from things like video games, want to pay for those video games. They just want it to be easy. And so the same thing with music with Spotify. But maybe just staying on the 90s, there are going to be a lot of indie game developers who listen to us talking today. Can you go back to that mindset and try to derive some wisdom and advice to those folks when you were just a solo developer, maybe just a small group of people uh, creating your early games that eventually became this uh, huge gaming company? But in the early days, what were you going through? What were the ups and downs? What did it take to sort of stay strong and persevere?
Well, one of the critical things that Epic always worked hard to do was to make something different, that nobody else was doing, and to try to satisfy a small audience rather than competing globally with the game juggernauts. Back in the 1990s, Epic was new, but Electronic Arts and Activision and the other big publishers had been around for a decade, and they were huge companies that had giant retail distribution networks. If I tried to make a game and then convince them to publish it, I doubt I could have had a chance, and I doubt that even if I made a successful game, that I would have made much money from it, though they might have. And so the really unique angle to Epic then was shareware. And that was just the idea that if we distribute our game differently, then we can reach a much larger audience than these bigger competitors by virtue of this first episode of the game being free. It was kind of the advent of what later became free to play. And the logic of that is just as true now as it was then. It's if the thing is free and anybody can get into it, then it's going to spread from friend to friend as
Hmm.
people bring their real world friends into the games they're playing, and have the opportunity to build up a community around that. So the other lesson there was just minimize the friction of people getting into your game, make it easy to get into, and make it fun. And I think the other well. I was very fortunate. ZZT was a funny game. It was not like much like any other game. It had much worse graphics because it was all just text characters, smiley faces, and other Greek letters and things participating in this game simulation. They were kind of iconic representations of characters rather than real ones. And this was decades into the age of real graphical games with interesting graphics. And so it wasn't even trying to compete in that area, but it was able to compete in a different area, which is that it wasn't just the three games that I'd made and shipped as a trilogy that were successful and drove the success of the product. It was the fact that I released an editor and there's a whole community around it. And you see that trend has repeated itself. Like there was ZZT was one of it. Before that, there was Bill Budge's Pinball Construction Set. That was a 1980s Apple game that let users build their own pinball tables. And since then, you've had some of the world's most successful games follow that path, like Minecraft. You can build your own stuff. Roblox, now Fortnite Creative and Unreal Editor for Fortnite. Games that become platforms for other people to build stuff was a real opportunity. I think the big thing to realize is for indie developers right now is like there's massive, massive competition in every major genre, and so it's very unlikely that unless you just happen to be the world's best at a particular thing, that you're going to release a game in an existing highly competitive genre and win. A much better chance of success is in releasing something that hasn't been done before, being really unique and reaching an audience, even if big or medium size or small, reaching an audience and becoming really popular with that, making some money from it and being able to reinvest and then expand towards your ultimate dream. I think the one shot go from idea to commercial success at massive scale is a lot less likely than the multi-step process of continually build better and better stuff over time until you get into a position of excellence.
And constantly try to do something that others aren't doing.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you look at every market, there's a few markets where the current leader came late to the space, usually because the prior leader failed so horribly. But most of the time, the company that's succeeding and winning in a market is the first or second entrant there. They've just continually buoyed their success.
Great advice and fascinating. But on a human level, was it lonely? Was it scary? You sitting there as a developer?
I'd say it was the opposite of lonely because you know the thing that spurred me to actually release this was seeing kids playing the game in my neighborhood and having fun and being like, "This is really good." And seeing them enjoying it and laughing and pointing at the screen and getting together and just wanting to play more.
That's awesome.
Um, yeah, so and the human element was always pervasive, because I did not only receive orders, but people would actually write letters. We wrote letters back then in the 1990s. People would say how much they were enjoying the game and how their kids were playing the game and so on and so on. So felt very connected. Um, and I think a lot of businesses have to make scary decisions because you're spending potentially all of the money you have to take a shot at something that you're not sure will succeed. Uh, I was very fortunate starting a business like this because it didn't really need any capital. The capital was, well, the several $1,000s in computers I'd bought by mowing lawns. um, and it wasn't much risk. If that hadn't succeeded, I guess I could have figured out how people get mechanical engineering jobs and pursued that. But once it took off and once the orders started coming in and people started writing letters saying they're enjoying the game, I knew I was going to go all out and try to build a company there and succeed. And that was like going to be my big goal.